Welcome. As the day fades and the outside world quiets, take a moment to set aside your thoughts and allow yourself to drift not toward dreams just yet, but into the past. A distant past. One where the comforts of your bed, the warmth of running water, and the quiet hum of electricity are luxuries so unimaginable they might as well be magic. Tonight, you'll walk the shadowed paths of medieval cities, not as a noble or a knight, but as one of the most invisible, most indispensable, and most deeply reviled workers of the time. You will become a Gong farmer, a man tasked with cleaning out the cesspits, the waste barrels, and the foul underbelly of daily life. This was not a job for the faint of heart, nor the sensitive of nose. It was done in darkness, in silence, and always from the edges of society. But without it, the filth would rise into homes, into marketplaces, into the water people drank and the air they breathed. Before we descend, if you enjoy these quiet journeys into forgotten history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us keep telling these slow, soothing stories, and it lets you join us each time we drift into the past. And while you're here with us, tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Are you winding down at midnight? Or dozing off just past dusk? We'd love to know who's falling asleep with history in their ears. So now, settle in, breathe slowly, and imagine yourself in a narrow alley between high, leaning walls. The moonlight casting long, crooked shadows. A distant clatter of hooves on cobblestones slowly fading into silence. And just beneath your feet, beneath the city, another world waits. A world of cold stone, rank air, and silent, thankless labor. Let us descend into it now. The tools of the trade: buckets, ropes, and rags. The Gong farmer had no grand equipment, no intricate machinery, no coat of arms or shining badge of trade. Only the tools that could be made or salvaged simple, brutal, and effective. Before the first pit could be touched, the Gong farmer had to gather his gear, often stored in a low shed at the edge of town, or bundled in oilcloth beneath his own floorboards if he had a place to call home. The tools were few, but each one was essential, and each bore the weight of years, not just in grime, but in memory. Tools that had been passed down, repurposed, repaired. They were not pretty, but they worked. First, the bucket, always made of wood, bound with iron rings or thick hemp rope, and sometimes lined with a thin layer of tar to prolong its life. These buckets were not the neat pails used to carry water or ale. They were squat, wide-mouthed, and heavy even when empty. Gong farmer might carry 2 or 3 at once, suspended from a yoke across his shoulders, or strapped with ropes that bit into his palms. The insides were stained dark permanently, the outside often slick. If one cracked, it would be patched with leather. If the base wore through, another plank might be hammered in, but rarely were they replaced entirely. New buckets were expensive, and no cooper relished the task of making one for this line of work. Then, the rope. A length of coarse hemp, twisted by hand or purchased in long strands from the docks. Rope was a lifeline literally. It secured the bucket, anchored the ladder, braced the worker, and helped haul loads up from impossible depths. A good Gong farmer inspected his rope nightly. A frayed edge or weakened knot could mean disaster. In winter, the rope stiffened, soaking in the frozen damp of the ground and growing brittle. In summer, it swelled with moisture and clung like a snake around your arm. You learned to know your rope by feel, which parts bore your weight, which knots you could trust, and which frayed ends needed trimming. Next, the shovel. More of a scoop, really. Wide, flat, and short-handled, it was designed to move waste, not soil. Some farmers used metal blades, though these were prone to rust and were heavier in the hand. Others carved their own from wood, reinforced at the edges with hammered scraps of tin or copper. Whatever the material, the motion was always the same: dig, lift, pour. A good shovel had just enough curve to cradle, but not so much as to slop over the sides. Then came the rags, bundles of cloth, torn from old tunics or purchased by the sack from market stalls. Not for wiping away filth, that task was endless, but for wrapping around the hands, stuffing into collars, or tying over the nose and mouth in a futile effort to block the smell. They did little. The stench seeped through everything. But the act of covering one's face brought a kind of psychological shield, a barrier, however thin, between the man and his task. There were other things, too. A small ladder, usually no more than 10 rungs, its sides coated in wax to resist moisture. A hooked pole, used to stir the contents of deeper pits or retrieve lost tools. A lantern or torch, carried low to avoid setting fumes alight though explosions were rare. They were not unheard of. Sometimes a Gong farmer would carry a canvas apron, stiff with use and crusted at the hems. Or boots, high and sealed with pitch, though many worked in nothing more than wrapped feet or old shoes, sacrificed to the task. Protection was minimal. Cost was always a concern. And so, as the night wore on, you moved from site to site with your small collection of tools. No one would look twice at them. No one would steal them. To most, they were symbols of shame. But to you, they were survival. They were the difference between a night's labor and a night of struggle. They were the reason the streets did not drown. Smell that never leaves. Life marked by permanent stench. There are some things you can wash away. Dirt beneath your nails. Mud on your boots. Even the sweat that collects in the small of your back after hours of hard labor. But the smell of a Gong farmer's work that never truly leaves. It is not a single odor, not the sharp scent of rot or the sourness of old milk, not the bite of vinegar or the oily weight of grease. It is a compound scent, layered and aged, like the dregs at the bottom of a spoiled barrel. At first, it strikes you as something external, a thing on your skin, on your clothes, in the fibers of your tunic or the seams of your boots. So you scrub, and you change, and you scrub again, but it clings. And then you realize it is no longer on you. It is in you. The pits release more than waste. They exhale a kind of slow decay, a miasma, a presence. The warm, ammoniac breath of centuries-old offal stirred from its resting place. As you bend and lift, shovel and pour, it surrounds you, settles into your mouth, your ears, the soft places behind your eyes. You breathe through your mouth, but it finds its way in still. When you finally return home hours later, shoulders aching, skin chafed, eyelids heavy, you remove your outer garments and hang them by the door. But the scent follows. It's in your hair. It's on the back of your hands. It's soaked into the threadbare wool of your underclothes. You sit by the fire and try to warm your fingers, and still, you can smell it. Neighbors notice too, even if they never say it to your face. They catch it when you walk past, or if the wind shifts just wrong. Children crinkle their noses. Shopkeepers subtly avoid placing your bread in the same basket as others. Women cross the street. Dogs bark. And so, after a time, you stop trying. You stop scrubbing your skin raw. You stop soaking your hands in vinegar or lye, because you come to understand that you are not simply a man who smells. You are a man who is smelled always, wherever you go, in whatever company you keep. And this, more than the work itself, is what marks you. The stench becomes your shadow. Even on your day of rest, it lingers. Even when you bathe, it returns. Because it is not just what you carry, it is what others believe you carry. And in a world where reputation clings more tightly than truth, the smell is not just in your clothes. It is in your name. The gruesome life of a medieval Gong farmer. The midnight shift. Why waste was only removed at night. Imagine this. You've been asleep for only a few hours when a low knock at your door rouses you, not from inside a warm bed, but from atop a bedroll laid out on rough straw. The air is cool, damp. The only light in the room is the flickering orange cast of a dying fire in the hearth, casting elongated shadows against cracked plaster walls. You stretch slowly, bones aching, joints stiff from the previous night's labor. The day ahead for most others is now ending. Lamps are being snuffed. Taverns are pouring their final mugs of ale. Bakers are covering their dough for tomorrow's bread. But for you, this is when life begins. Because no one wants to see what you do. And certainly, no one wants to smell it. You are a Gong farmer, a man who removes human waste from the cesspits and privies of the medieval city. It is work that must be done. But it must be done out of sight. The world above is not kind to reminders of its own filth. Across many cities in medieval England, London, York, Chester, and throughout towns in continental Europe as well, civic laws forbade the emptying of privies or the carting away of dung during daylight hours. To be seen shoveling dung in the streets under the sun, one London ordinance proclaimed, is to offend the king's peace and the eyes of the good citizenry. The fear wasn't just aesthetic, it was practical. The streets of medieval towns were narrow, some just a few feet across, and most were unpaved, deeply rutted, and crowded even in the quiet hours. Horses clattered past, their hooves uneven on the cobbles. Merchants wheeled carts and shouted wares. Beggars loitered near churches. Chickens and dogs wandered freely. In the chaos of daytime commerce, trying to carry open barrels of human refuse from one end of the town to the other wasn't just unsanitary, it was dangerous. One trip or spill, and the results could be both revolting and riot-inducing. So, the Gong farmer moved by moonlight. Wrapped in rough woolen layers that barely masked the cold or the smell, he lit a rushlight or candle stub and stepped out into the chill darkness. Often, he was accompanied by one or two other men assistants, apprentices, or simply hired hands who needed coin. The streets were quieter at this hour, but far from safe. In the silence of midnight, your footsteps felt louder. Every creak of a door or rustle of a rat in the shadows might make you pause. Bandits lurked in alleys. And the town guard, if they found you out of place or without proof of your work, might not ask questions before dragging you in. Still, you pressed on. Down the familiar lanes, past shuttered homes, through damp alleys where laundry still hung limp on lines. Your destination, a cesspit, perhaps behind a large merchant house or beneath a row of rental tenements. Some were shallow, others were deep enough to swallow a man whole. As you walked, the smells of the town shifted, from chimney smoke and roasted meat near the inns to the sour, clinging stench of rotted waste. You knew every scent well. You knew which streets housed the worst pits, which families paid on time, which ones didn't, and which ones tried to cheat by emptying their filth illegally into the street gutters, an act that could poison the water supply and earn heavy fines if discovered. But your task was not to enforce. Your job was only to remove, quietly, thoroughly, and always in darkness. The silence of the midnight shift held a strange rhythm, the sound of your boots squelching in mud, the distant barking of a dog, the slosh of liquid in your barrel. It was a rhythm most never heard, most never wanted to. Yet without you, the city would drown in its own filth. And still, they looked away. The shift had just begun, and the worst was yet to come. Into the cesspit, crawling through raw sewage by torchlight. The cesspit waits. You've reached your destination, a narrow yard hemmed in by stone walls, silent but for the faint dripping of moisture and the quiet scurry of something small along the far edge. The household slumbers behind shuttered windows. They will never greet you. They will never thank you. Their waste has been collecting for weeks, fermenting in the pit beneath the wooden privy shed. And tonight, it's your turn to descend. You crouch low, lifting a creaky latch from the shed door. The hinges groan softly as you open it, revealing a splintering bench with a single round hole cut through its center. The wood is damp from condensation, and it carries a permanent sourness that no wind can ever lift. You pause for a moment and lower your bucket beside you, pulling a length of rope from your shoulder and the stub of a burning torch from your pouch. It's not much, just a bundle of cloth soaked in tallow, tied to a wooden stick, but it gives off a flickering, weak light. You strike flint to steel, carefully shielding the flame from the draft. The spark catches. A pale orange glow fills the space, throwing thick shadows against the stone wall. You take a deep breath, but only through your mouth. Through your nose, the air is unbearable. Then, with practiced effort, you lift the wooden bench and brace it against the wall. Beneath it is the pit, a dark, gaping hole filled with months of accumulated waste. There is no uniformity. Some parts are thick and heavy, others runny. There are remnants of straw, shavings of cloth, discarded bones, and the indistinguishable remains of things thrown down in frustration or haste. You've seen it all before. Bits of broken pottery, teeth, a child's rag doll, long lost. Once a severed finger. You reach for the first bucket and tie it tightly to the rope. Then, slowly, you lower it into the pit. The rope grows heavier in your hands as the bucket fills. You do not hear a splash. You hear a thick, glutinous suck, and then resistance. The bucket is full. You begin to pull, hand over hand, feeling the strain in your arms. Your gloves are made of thick canvas, but still, the moisture creeps in. When the bucket emerges, it drips with foul liquid, the sides slick and discolored. Carefully, you set it aside and lower another. Again and again. Some cesspits, though, are too deep or too wide to reach by rope alone. In those, you must go down. A narrow ladder is kept nearby, wooden, crude, stained black over years of use. You plant it carefully, testing for stability, and slowly begin your descent. Torch gripped between your teeth or clamped under your arm. Each rung creaks beneath your weight. The walls grow closer, the air warmer, thicker. The smell here is not simply unpleasant. It is oppressive. It clings to your clothes, your skin, your very breath. Your boots sink into the sludge with each step. You do not look down, you cannot see much anyway, but you know exactly what you're standing in. Every movement is careful. One misstep, and you may sink deeper than your knees. The gases that rise from the pit are dangerous. They can suffocate a man if the air is too still. And sometimes, the surface gives way entirely. In the faint flicker of your torchlight, you begin to shovel. Each scoop is heavy. The waste sticks to the blade. You twist your wrist just so, knowing from experience how to flick the contents into the pail without splatter. The silence is broken only by the slow rhythm of your movements. Scoop, lift, pour, repeat. This task can take hours, and in the dark, hours stretch. Time loses its shape. The fire dims, your muscles burn. But still, you work, because the pit must be emptied. Because tomorrow, a family will return to this shed and sit, unaware of your labor. The cycle will begin again. You finish the last bucket. Your arms are trembling. The ladder groans as you ascend. Back in the open air, the breeze feels sharp, almost cold. You wipe your face with a rag, but it does little good. The smell is everywhere now, in your hair, your beard, the inside of your mouth. You gather your tools, your buckets, and you move on to the next pit, because the night is far from over. Shunned by all, social status of the nightman. In the delicate, brittle hierarchy of medieval life, a man's status was never truly his own. It clung to him like inherited fabric, worn, patched, but rarely chosen. And for the Gong farmer known in some towns as the nightman, the muckraker, or simply the one who deals with it. That status was at the very bottom of the pile. Not criminal, not enslaved, but something close to untouchable. You could walk among others, purchase bread, rent a room, offer coin to the tavern maid, but it wouldn't matter. Your face might be familiar, your behavior courteous, your work essential, but your place in the invisible order that governed medieval life was fixed. From the moment someone knew what you did for a living, the rules changed. People avoided eye contact, not out of cruelty, but out of instinct, an ingrained, unspoken understanding that your presence reminded them of what they preferred not to think about, what they flushed away with buckets of water or ignored behind shuttered doors. You were the return of the repressed, a walking reminder of filth, decay, and the base nature of the body. You sat alone, if you sat at all. In church, you found space at the far end, near the cold stone walls. At feast days, you were not expected to bring food, nor were you offered much. Children were told not to play near your door. If you married, it was likely to someone of your own station another, whose skin bore the same invisible ink. Perhaps a washerwoman, a tanner, or someone else from the laboring castes that dealt in what the polite world cast off. In some towns, you were barred from certain streets entirely during daylight, not by law, always, but by practice. Unspoken, enforced through gesture and silence. In others, your trade earned you a peculiar pariah's license. You could move freely, even speak boldly, because no one wished to get too close. It was as if your filth gave you a kind of authority one wrapped in revulsion. Even the people who paid you often did so through intermediaries. A servant left coins on a stool by the door. A merchant passed a wrapped parcel through a crack in the shutters. They wanted the benefit of your labor, but not the touch of your fingers. And so, over time, the nightmen learned to speak less, to move quickly, to make themselves small in crowds. They developed their own customs, their own shared understanding, like those who dwell on the edges of things often do. They learned to laugh only among themselves, to bathe together in the river before dawn, to keep their own small company in a world that wanted their work, but not their presence. Because status was not always written in laws or proclaimed from pulpits. Sometimes it was carried silently in the way others stood too far, held their breath, or never quite met your eyes. And so you moved through the town as one both necessary and erased, a ghost with weight, a servant no one dared call by name. Suffocation and collapse, the very real dangers of cave-ins. Not all cesspits were shallow, not all were well built, and not all were meant to be revisited. Some lay beneath the ground like open mouths, lined with rough stone or sunken timber, filled over time not just with waste, but with pressure, decay, and silence. And when your job was to enter these spaces, to lower yourself into the dark underworld of a medieval city, danger didn't announce itself with shouts or flames. It whispered. It waited. And then, sometimes, it simply took. There were no safety protocols, no regulations, no structural reinforcements or routine inspections. Just a man, a rope, a ladder, and the hope that the walls would hold. Imagine standing at the edge of a pit that's been sealed for months, maybe even years. The privy above has long been used, perhaps by a dozen people every day. The material inside has settled, like thick porridge beneath a crust. But beneath that crust, the contents are liquid, unstable, fermenting under their own slow chemical steam. You test the surface with your shovel. It gives just a little. You descend anyway. With your torch burning low and the air already tight in your lungs, you step into the pit. Your boots sink with a slow, sucking sound. You try not to think about how deep. You brace yourself against the side walls, which are sometimes just packed dirt, or crumbling stone held together with time and hope. Then the shovel bites too deep, or your weight shifts just enough. or the wall was always going to give way. And it begins. A groan deep and low, like the sound of a heavy cart rolling over broken cobble. Then a cracking noise subtle, but unmistakable. A section of wall begins to collapse, sending chunks of filth and rotted stone tumbling in. The ladder rocks. The pit narrows. The stench intensifies suddenly, as if disturbed. You have seconds. If the pit is deep enough, and the collapse significant, the air is sucked out. Not all at once, but subtly, cruelly. A gasp becomes difficult. The torch flickers strangely. Your hands grow slick. Your heartbeat becomes the only sound. In moments like this, the real fear is not drowning in filth, though that is possible. The fear is being buried alive beneath it. Of having the surface seal above you like a lid. Of your shouts going unheard in the pre-dawn dark. Of your body never being recovered, just becoming part of the next layer for the next man to shovel. Many cesspits were never mapped. Many had hidden chambers, old latrines, collapsed storage rooms, forgotten vaults beneath inns or churches. You stepped in not knowing where the bottom was. Sometimes the bottom gave way. Sometimes it had never been meant to carry weight at all. In London, in York, in Bruges, in Cologne records exist of men who went down and never came back, their names rarely kept. Their roles described only in passing, in guild fines or court cases involving interruption of service or loss of materials. And so the Gong farmer developed an ear for warning sounds, a sense for loose stone, a practiced caution when entering new pits. He tested before stepping. He braced his legs just so, and he never, ever worked alone. But no amount of experience could remove the risk entirely, because the earth, like the waste it held, could turn without notice, and the pit, like the world above, offered no promises. Just the work, and the chance that tonight might be the last shift you ever complete. Vermin, rot, and parasites. Everything you didn't want to meet. In the stillness of a cesspit, it was never truly silent. Even if the night outside held its breath, something always moved in the dark below. Not men, not voices, but smaller things. More ancient things. Things that crept, burrowed, fed, and multiplied. When you entered a pit, it was not just waste you were disturbing. It was a thriving, seething ecosystem, built on rot and sustained by what the rest of the world discarded. Rats were the most obvious. They came in droves, sometimes bold as stray dogs, sometimes silent as dust. You'd see their eyes' first low reflections in the torchlight, blinking and vanishing. In the shallower cesspits, they clung to the wooden walls, or darted through cracks in the stone. Large ones could grow fat on the scraps tossed down with the dung-moldy bread, fish bones, vegetable peelings, even the occasional carcass. Some could swim. Some could climb. All carried fleas. Gong farmers learned to ignore them, or pretend to. You wore thick trousers if you could afford them, tucked your sleeves into your gloves, and tried not to flinch when something scurried across your boot. The rats weren't interested in you. Not usually, but they were there, always, and bold when the pit was warm and the night was long. And then there were the insects. Not the kind you swat at with annoyance. These were denizens of decay dung flies, maggots, worms, and burrowing beetles, each fulfilling their little role in the grand, grotesque dance of decomposition. They crawled across the surface of the waste in slow, undulating waves. They nested in the corners of the pit, beneath loose stonework, behind mold-blackened timber supports. Some hung in clouds. Others lay in wait on the undersides of your tools, your sleeves, your skin. And what they didn't do directly, they often carried with them tiny stowaways of disease and discomfort. Gong farmers were no strangers to lice, or to itching that never truly ended. Rashes bloomed along the backs of knees, underarms, along the hairline. You might not notice them at first, until sleep became impossible and scratching drew blood. Then came the real threats: intestinal parasites, eye infections, and skin boils that emerged like slow, aching punishments. A man might be fine one day, sluggish the next, and bedridden the day after that, if he had a bed at all. Some pits were old enough, deep enough, or mismanaged enough to become entire breeding grounds for fungus and mold. You'd see the slick white sheen of bacterial bloom on the surface, the black streaks along the walls, the green film that shimmered faintly at the waterline. And you'd breathe it in with every slow exhale, despite the cloth tied over your mouth, despite your careful posture, despite the little prayers muttered under your breath. Sometimes, when work was slow or pits ran deep, a farmer would return to the same one night after night. In those cases, the dangers grew. The deeper the rot, the thicker the life. And some of that life was always waiting for you. You learned to check your legs for bites, to pour vinegar down your sleeves, to keep a little ash in your pouch to rub on infected skin. Old methods, half remedies, better than nothing, because you couldn't afford to fall ill. There was no compensation for the sick, and if you were lucky enough to heal, you'd still have to return back into the same pit with the same vermin, the same rot, the same crawling company that never truly left you. Illegal dumping and fines. When no one wanted the job done, you might think that a job so vile, so essential, so universally shunned, would at least be met with grateful compliance. That those who benefited from it, the taverns, the wealthy merchants, the guild halls and manors, would do their part to make it easier. That they pay their dues, grant access, follow the laws. But more often than not, they didn't. In fact, one of the Gong farmer's most frustrating burdens wasn't the filth he hauled by night. It was the resistance he faced from the very people who needed him most. Resistance cloaked in coin-pinching, avoidance, deception, and sometimes outright illegality. Let's start with cesspits left too long. It wasn't uncommon for tenants or innkeepers to ignore their pits until they overflowed, until the stench could no longer be blamed on neighbors, until insects began to breed beneath floorboards, and rats emerged not just from the corners of the yard, but through the boards of the privy itself. And only then, when the mess became a crisis, would the Gong farmer be summoned. Not with apology, of course, but with complaint. Why hadn't he come sooner? Why was it so expensive? Couldn't he do it faster? In wealthier households, it was more subtle. Privies were built too narrow for easy access, or the doors were kept locked to protect valuables, meaning the farmer had to wait until someone remembered to unlock them or climb over hedges and walls just to reach the pit. And then there was the coin. Always the coin. Some homes paid weekly, others monthly. Many pretended to forget altogether. And when confronted, they might say, "Oh, it's been taken care of," or "the steward handles these matters." The steward, of course, was never home. But the worst offenses happened not above ground, but below it, because many citizens, out of greed or simple unwillingness, emptied their own cesspits illegally. Instead of hiring a nightman, they would remove the contents under cover of darkness and dump it directly into the streets, rivers, or open drainage ditches. Sometimes they'd bury it in shallow pits beneath gardens. Other times, they would throw it over the city wall or into a nearby alley. One of the more common techniques in dense towns was to lift a cobblestone, pour the waste beneath it, and replace the stone, leaving a foul surprise for the next passerby or patrol. This wasn't just unpleasant. It was dangerous. Dumping waste in unauthorized places posed serious health risks. It contaminated water supplies, attracted vermin, and accelerated the spread of disease. Town authorities understood this, and many cities had ordinances specifically forbidding such behavior. In 14th century London, for instance, violators could face heavy fines, public shaming, or in extreme cases, imprisonment. But enforcement was difficult. The act was done at night, in silence, and usually in haste. Unless the culprit was caught in the act, the evidence, though pungent, was rarely enough to convict. And who was expected to clean it up? Not the magistrate, not the guards, not the merchant who caused the mess. You, the Gong farmer, you, who already worked the whole of the night, now tasked with cleaning up what others refused to handle properly in the first place, without payment, without thanks. In some towns, special watchers were employed to report illegal dumping. But even then, the guilty were rarely punished unless they were poor, unlucky, or already unpopular. And so the Gong farmer, covered in another man's negligence, another man's stink, trudged from street to alley, collecting what was never meant to be spilled. Because no one wanted the job done, but no one wanted it not done either. And in that paradox, the Gong farmer toiled silently cleaning up the shame of a society that refused to look in its own privy. Pay was decent because no one else would do it. There's a strange irony in labor so detested, so degrading, so openly avoided that it becomes profitable. And that was the case, more often than not, with the Gong farmer. You see, while the position bore every imaginable social stigma, while it marked you with odor, isolation, and disdain, it also paid better than many forms of honest work. Not lavishly and not consistently, but better. Why? Because no one else would do it. In a world where most peasants toiled from dawn to dusk in fields for mere pennies, harvesting barley, tending sheep, hauling water, a Gong farmer, working primarily by night, could earn more in a week than a plowman did in a month. The reason was simple: risk, repulsion, and rarity. The job was risky. As we've seen, there were cesspit collapses, disease, falls, infections, suffocation. It was repulsive, marked by filth, odor, and vermin. And it was rare, because almost no one was willing to apply for the role. This meant that those who were willing, those who braved the job long enough to gain experience, found themselves in reluctantly high demand. In cities like York and Bristol, nightmen were sometimes hired by the borough council, contracted as municipal sanitation workers, long before such a term existed. These men were paid in coin, and occasionally in goods like food, firewood, or cloth. Larger homes or inns might pay directly, negotiating a rate based on the depth of the pit, its distance from the street, and the frequency of the visits. For especially unpleasant jobs, like clearing cesspits under taverns or cleaning blocked chutes in the colder months, Gong farmers could name their price. Within reason, of course. No one wanted to haggle long in a room that smelled of fermenting waste. And yet, for all that, the job never elevated a man. You could make money, yes. You could save it even. But you could not rise. Because money, in the medieval world, did not always purchase respect. It could buy land, but not if no one would sell to you. It could buy better clothing, but they would still be worn by someone known to be a nightman. It could buy entry to a tavern, but you would still drink alone. So many nightmen used their wages not to climb higher, but to prepare for escape, to save enough to buy into another trade, maybe as a porter, a teamster, a seller of firewood, to send their children to apprenticeships in more respectable crafts, to buy time, if not acceptance. Some succeeded. Many did not, because the longer you stayed, the harder it was to leave. The smell clung, the name followed. The profession became the person. But at the end of each week, when your limbs ached, your skin itched, and your nose still burned with the memory of the pits, you had coins in your pouch. Not many, but more than the man who spent his days swinging a scythe under the sun. And in a world where hunger waited behind every bad harvest, every failed season, coin meant survival, not comfort, not respect, but survival. And that, perhaps, was enough. Body collectors, dragging the dead through the streets. If the diggers worked at the end of death's journey, the body collectors stood at its beginning. They were the ones who entered homes, courtyards, cellars, and back alleys quiet, tense, and alert not to save life, but to remove what life had already left behind. Their task was simple, brutal, and unrelenting. Locate the dead, move them out, and deliver them to the pits. In a city where death outpaced the living, this was no small duty. The body collectors began their rounds at dawn, pushing two-wheeled wooden carts through the still, foul air of half-sleeping streets. Their approach was marked not by ceremony, but by sound wooden wheels on uneven stone, a faint creak with every turn, sometimes accompanied by a dull bell or a slow chant. Bring out your dead. Bring out your dead. Sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, always heard. This was not a call for drama, but a warning. The collectors were coming. And if you had someone to offer, you had best be ready. Outside each door, wrapped in blankets or sheets, the bodies waited, sometimes alone, sometimes with loved ones standing nearby, blank-faced, distant, clutching at rosaries or each other. Sometimes the collector found no one waiting, just the body itself, cooling in a hallway or beneath a bed. Entry into the home was not always granted, nor was it always required. Some collectors knocked, others did not. When entire families were dead or fled, they simply entered through windows, broken doors, gaps in timber. They moved with caution, but also urgency, for they had miles of city to cover before the sun set, and the work only grew heavier by the hour. Lifting the dead was its own skill. Some were like infants, the aged, those long without food. Others were heavy with the final swellings of death, with fluids trapped in the body, limbs rigid with rigor mortis. When rigor had passed, the weight grew slack, folding in odd angles, making the job more difficult. The collectors used sheets, ropes, and leather straps to bind the dead for transport, tying hands and feet to keep bodies from spilling awkwardly from the cart as they bounced over cobbles and gutters. And the cart itself simple, crude, was often lined with hay, if hay could be found. If not, nothing but bare wood. As the day wore on, the cart filled. The smell rose. The effort increased. Some collectors wore cloths soaked in herbs or vinegar over their faces, but most learned to breathe shallowly, to steel themselves against the relentless weight of rot, and to keep their eyes forward. They did not ask questions. They did not linger. They did not weep. For to weep would be to acknowledge what they touched, and they touched too much. And still, sometimes, there were moments, small ones, when the horror broke through. A child, clutching a ragged doll. A woman dressed carefully in her Sunday gown, as if still preparing for Mass. A man with coins sewn into his belt, meant for a future he never reached. The collectors noted these things. Then they moved on, for the carts were full, but the city still whispered more names, and the streets ahead were not yet empty. The smell of contagion, rot and fear in the summer air. It began before you saw anything, before the carts, before the weeping, before the knock at the door. It began with the smell, not the smell of ordinary filth, the kind that clung to chamber pots or drifted faintly from the gutters after a long day. Not the smell of livestock or of the tanner's quarter or of spoiled meat in a street stall. This smell was different. It moved on the wind like an invisible omen, heavy, sweet, sickening in its sweetness. It clung low to the ground in the early hours, then thickened in the heat of the afternoon. It crawled beneath doors, into churches, through broken windows and tightly latched shutters. In the summer of 1349, London baked. The River Thames moved slow and shallow. Refuse piled high in alleyways. The graveyards bulged with loosened earth. And above all, that smell persisted, a warning without language. It was the scent of too many bodies, too hastily buried. The aroma of decay without rest. Of linens steeped in sickness and left hanging too long. Of walls soaked with sweat and blood and breath that ended in stillness. Doctors, those few who remained, spoke of bad airs, or miasmas as they were called, invisible poisons drifting through the atmosphere. They believed that to inhale the air itself was to invite the plague inside. So they carried posies bundles of herbs and dried flowers pressed to their faces in hope of masking it. Some burned incense or hung sprigs of rosemary above their beds. Others clutched pungent roots or onions, believing they could absorb the rot, but nothing helped for long. Because the smell was not just in the air. It was in the walls, in the wood, in the clothes of every person who touched the dead. The body collectors reeked of it. The diggers, too. Even the carts, once emptied, carried its memory. And so fear spread not just by rumor or death toll, but by breath. People turned away from each other in the street. They held scarves over their mouths, even when no one was nearby. Some refused to leave their homes entirely, sealing the doors with wax and prayer. But fear, like the plague, had many forms. It whispered in the heads of those still uninfected. Is that cough a sign? Is that heat in my chest the first spark? Did I inhale too deeply at market? And through it all, the air remained thick, slow, unmoving. Even the birds grew quiet. Even the dogs seemed to howl more at night. In time, the smell of contagion became a second presence in the city. Not death itself, but its herald. Its breath, its signature. It marked homes before the cloth was hung. It warned before the fever came. It lingered even after the windows were thrown open, and the floors were scrubbed with vinegar and prayers. Some claimed they could smell it for months afterward. Some claimed it never left. And in truth, perhaps it didn't. Perhaps it became a part of London itself, another layer beneath the stones. Another memory trapped in wood and wind. The danger of touch, bubonic plague, and bare hands. In ordinary times, the touch of another person was simple. A handshake, a hand on the shoulder, a shared cup, a nudge in a crowd. But in plague-ridden London, touch became something else entirely. It became a gamble, a sentence, a line that separated the living from the soon-to-be dead. The body collectors, the diggers, the washerwomen, even the clergy, anyone whose work brought them close to the sick or the recently deceased, understood this in ways few others could. They saw what touch could do, not right away, but in days. It began with a brush of the fingers, lifting a limb, adjusting a shoulder, dragging a body across the floor with nothing but a wool cloth wrapped around the palms. Then, perhaps the next morning, they'd feel it. A tightness in the throat, a subtle heat behind the eyes, a swelling beneath the arm. So small it could be mistaken for a strain. By nightfall, it was not mistaken anymore. They knew, those who worked with the dead, that they were vulnerable in every gesture. They tried, in their own ways, to build barriers. Some wore gloves, thick leather ones if they could be found, but most had only woolen mitts or wrapped linen soaked in vinegar. Some wrapped their arms, creating a double layer of cloth to shield their sleeves from rot. A few fashioned rudimentary masks, not the beaked masks of the plague doctors, not yet common, but simple scarves or veils. All of it was for naught if the skin broke. A scratch on the hand, a splinter from the cart, a cracked nail. Because the plague did not always need a deep wound, just contact, just skin to skin, just enough to open the door. The men quickly learned not to touch their faces, not to scratch their necks, not to wipe away sweat with the back of a dirty hand. But old habits crept in under fatigue, and fear made hands tremble, which made accidents more frequent. What made it worse was that the disease wasn't always visible. In the early stages, some bodies looked peaceful. No blood, no wounds. Just a quiet slackness of the mouth, a stillness around the eyes. You might think this one is safe, but you'd be wrong, because the plague didn't wait for the body to bloat or bruise. It lingered in the blood, in the sweat, in the very breath of the dead, There were no disinfectants, no understanding of bacteria or viruses, no gloves that were truly impermeable, only hope and habit and the desperate human instinct to keep working, even as death pressed close. Some diggers kept wooden poles, used to nudge or turn bodies without touching them. Some used ropes, looped around limbs to drag the corpse onto the cart. But more often than not, touch was unavoidable. And with each body came a choice. Do the work and risk your life, or let the body lie and let death spread? Most chose the work, because no one else would, because they had mouths to feed, because, in the absence of cure, routine was the only protection they had, and so they touched. With hands wrapped in vinegar-soaked cloth, with arms stiffened against recoil, with faces turned away, not because they weren't afraid, but because there was no one else to touch the dead. Clergy who blessed from afar, in a world where faith shaped every breath from the cradle to the grave. The plague exposed an unspoken truth. Even the devout feared death, especially when death came not as a slow fading, but as a tidal wave, sudden and indiscriminate. The church in medieval London was not just a building, it was the center. It recorded your birth, sanctified your marriage, and marked your end with prayer. The priests and monks were the keepers of ritual, of comfort, of meaning. But in the plague years, their role shifted, not gone but distant. At the beginning, clergy responded as they always had. They came to the homes of the dying, performed last rites, offered confession, and anointed foreheads with holy oil. They held trembling hands. They whispered assurances. They buried the dead with dignity, even as their own numbers began to thin. But the plague did not respect cassocks or collars. It took bishops and novices alike. In monasteries, the death toll was devastating. Some orders lost half their brethren. Others vanished entirely. The very men tasked with guiding souls to the afterlife were falling faster than they could bury one another. As the death toll mounted, the presence of clergy grew fainter. Church bells still rang, but fewer hands were left to ring them. Parish priests still spoke, but often from a distance, standing in doorways or at the foot of stairs, refusing to cross thresholds. Blessings were murmured from behind cloaks soaked in vinegar. Sometimes they simply left a note on the door. I prayed for you. It was not abandonment. It was survival. The streets, once patrolled by friars tending the sick, grew quiet. In some parishes, lay brothers, those without formal training, took over duties of burial and sacrament. Masses were shortened. Confessions were shouted from behind closed doors. In extreme cases, priests refused entirely to enter plague homes. There were stories muttered in corners of clergy who locked church doors against the sick, or who fled to country abbeys, hoping that distance would offer protection where prayer could not. And still, the church did not collapse. It adapted. Some priests left blessed objects outside the doors of the dying crosses, vials of holy water, bits of bread or wine that the faithful could take themselves. Some communities appointed plague confessors, those willing to anoint the dying in exchange for land, coin, or promises of eternal reward. There were even blanket absolutions issued papal decrees forgiving the sins of those who died without confession, an unimaginable concession before the plague, and the people those who survived understood. They did not curse the priests who stayed away. They did not riot outside the churches, because even at a distance, the clergy still mattered, still whispered comfort, still represented something larger than the decay surrounding them. A man might die without a priest at his bedside, but if he heard the church bell in the distance, if he saw a figure in black robes raise a hand from across the square, if he smelled the faint trace of incense on the wind, then perhaps he died with hope. Even if no one touched him, even if the blessing came from afar, the unnamed heroes and their vanished graves. Not all heroes are clad in armor. Not all stand upon battlefields. Some wear threadbare cloaks soaked through with sweat, mud, and sorrow. Some die with shovels in hand, and no one watching. Among the tens of thousands lost during the Black Death, the names of kings and nobles have been remembered, etched into books, into marble, into song. But those who dug the graves, who hauled the dead, who risked their lives every hour, their names, almost all of them, are gone. There are no monuments to the plague-bit diggers, no carved stone effigies for the body collectors, no lists kept of the women who nursed the sick until they fell ill themselves. They were essential, but not recorded, not because they didn't matter, but because they were ordinary, poor, disposable, expected to do what they did without recognition. Some may have been buried in the very pits they helped dig. A misstep, a sudden fever, a name crossed off a list. Their comrades would lower them in silence, perhaps with a whispered prayer, perhaps just a nod, then move on to the next body. Work left no time for mourning. Others died alone in cold rooms, their clothes still heavy with soil and blood. Some made it home, only to find it emptied. No wife, no children, just the hollow echo of a place where life used to be. Their graves were rarely marked. Most were mass burials, with lines scattered over the top, the earth tamped down without ceremony. The sites, some now beneath car parks, others under schoolyards or chapels, remain largely unmarked. Centuries passed, cities grew, foundations were poured over their bones. The world forgot their faces, their voices, their hands, but not entirely. Archaeologists sometimes uncover their resting places. A field-turned construction site yields a row of skeletons, limbs folded neatly, teeth stained with rot, a coin still clenched between rib and arm. They are studied, yes, catalogued, handled gently, but still unnamed. Historians write about the diggers or the lower orders, but these are categories, not people. The real men, those who lived, suffered, and did what others would not remain silent. And yet they were heroes, not because they chose glory, not because they sought praise, but because they showed up, night after night, knowing what it might cost, knowing that the city could not function without them. They stood between the living and the dead. They made space for the fallen. They made time for the survivors. And even if no one thanked them then, and even if their names are dust now, their labor was the only reason the world moved forward. They were forgotten by history, but not by the soil, not by the silence, and tonight, not by us. How many bodies? Estimations that boggle the mind. At first, the numbers didn't seem real. A few here, a dozen there, a small uptick in burials, a few extra carts in the morning. But by the time winter crept in over the roofs of London in 1349, the question was no longer how many have died. It was, how many can the earth still hold? The records, such as they are incomplete. Medieval cities were not known for meticulous accounting, especially during catastrophe. Parish death rolls fell behind. Monks who kept careful tallies succumbed to the very thing they recorded. And entire households vanish without any mark at all. No will, no priest, no name. Still, historians and archaeologists have tried to understand the scale, to attach numbers to what defies counting. For London alone, the best estimates suggest that over 60,000 people died between the years 1348 and 1350. Some say half the city's population. Others say more. Compare that to a modern city, and imagine half its streets falling silent. Half its beds never slept in again. Half its stories ended, suddenly, without conclusion. And that's just one city. Across England, the plague may have claimed 1 to 2 million lives. Across Europe, tens of millions. Perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population of the continent. But those are numbers carved from silence. Approximations rising from the dust. They do not capture the scale of bodies carried one by one through muddy streets. They do not account for the overflowing pits, the abandoned homes, the fields left unharvested, nor do they capture the emotional arithmetic of the survivors. The child left without a parent, the merchant with no apprentices, the digger who buried his friend in the same trench as strangers. In London, one of the largest known plague pits at East Smithfield was excavated centuries later. Inside, layers upon layers of skeletons, some arranged with care, others tumbled together. They found traces of haste, wooden planks used as makeshift separators, odd angles of limbs, and hauntingly, signs that in the rush to bury the dead, some had not quite stopped breathing. But beyond the archaeology, beyond the scholarly estimates and bone charts, there remains something incomprehensible. What does it mean to bury so many people that no one remembers their names? What does it feel like to stand over a trench that stretches the length of a street, filled with the stillness of thousands, and know that you helped make space for them? For the diggers, the collectors, and the silent watchers, the question was not how many have died, but how many are still coming. Because in those weeks and months, death was not an event. It was a rhythm, and it never missed a beat. Archaeology of filth, excavating medieval sewers and waste systems. Hidden beneath the cobblestones, ancient latrine networks. To understand a medieval city, you must look beneath it. The cobbled streets and timber-bird houses that once lined the lanes of London, York, Paris, Lubeck, or Prague were merely the visible half of a much larger Messier system. Beneath the walkways, past the foundations and cellar stones, there lay something older, darker, and largely forgotten: the waste networks. Not sewer systems in the modern sense. No organized plumbing, no standardized pipes. What lay below were patchwork solutions to a problem that every city had, but few wished to address: where to put the waste. For centuries, human and animal excrement, food scraps, washing water, and butchered remains all had to go somewhere. So they went down. Some buildings had their own latrines, small rooms with wooden seats that emptied into pits dug directly beneath the house. These pits were often shallow, lined with rough stone or timber, and left unsealed. When they filled, the owner either hired someone like a Gong farmer to empty them, or didn't. In wealthier districts, latrines were sometimes connected to drains, rudimentary channels carved through the stone or packed earth, leading away from the property and into open ditches in the streets. There, the waste mingled with rainwater, laundry runoff, and the overflow of nearby cesspits. Some towns experimented with covered drains, long narrow tunnels running beneath the surface. These were often built without access points, making maintenance nearly impossible. Over time, these channels would clog, their contents fermenting in silence, pressing outward into foundations, into floorboards, until the smell became inescapable. The archaeological discovery of these networks in modern times has become an unexpected window into the truth of medieval life. Not the life written down in chronicles, but the daily grind of survival, of sanitation, of slow decay. In excavations beneath medieval streets, archaeologists have found entire networks of stone and timber-lined trenches, some still holding the remnants of what flowed through them. Black sludge hardened into clay, patches of compacted straw, and moss used as toilet paper. Even carved wooden seats still intact, their edges worn smooth by centuries of use. In towns like Winchester and Lubeck, latrine shafts have been found sunk deep into the ground, sometimes extending more than 10 feet, their walls reinforced with old planks. The sheer volume of material, inside layer upon layer of human waste, kitchen debris, cloth, hair, and animal bone speaks to years, even generations, of uninterrupted use. These structures were not just tools of sanitation. They became, unintentionally, time capsules. And they were rarely mapped. Few knew how far they reached. Even fewer cared until something went wrong. a collapsed tunnel, a rising stink, a plague outbreak traced to foul water. At which point, and only then, did the city respond. But when the danger passed, so too did the memory. The tunnels were sealed. The shafts were filled. The privy chutes were bricked over or built atop. The problem was buried, and over it, life continued. Until now, centuries later, when modern foundations scrape the earth, when subway systems are planned, or when new cellars are dug, ... and someone finds the past again. Not in marble, not in gold, but in rot. The forgotten, filthy architecture of survival. And in these tunnels, archaeologists do not just find waste. They find lives. What we found in the pit, seeds, bones, and lost jewelry. At first glance, a cesspit is just that, an ancient container of waste, a place where things were meant to disappear. But time, as it often does, has other plans. When archaeologists began excavating medieval latrine pits, whether beneath crumbled taverns in London, merchant houses in York, or along the Hanseatic trade routes, they expected filth. They prepared for decay. But what they found were fragments of lives, layered in mud, hardened by centuries, buried beneath the churn of modern construction. These pits had become silent hordes of discarded detail, because when something was dropped into a privy or sewer, it was almost never retrieved. It was lost, gone, abandoned to the dark. And so what we find now is an archive that no scribe could have written. Start with the seeds. Thousands of them: plum, cherry, apple, blackberry, grape, elder. Hard little time travelers, perfectly preserved in the oxygen-deprived depths of waste. They tell us what people ate, not what the nobles feasted on in halls, but what the average person chewed at a market stall or found in the woods. We find nutshells, crushed and broken. Fish bones, many of them small herring. Eels, salted cod, imported from Norway. And eggshells, delicate and curled inward like fists. Then there are the bones. Not just animal remains from meals, but sometimes human ones, too accidental or discarded. Fragments of teeth, a single toe bone, a child's milk tooth, likely lost and swept down with the floor sweepings. They tell no grand story, but they whisper something ordinary, something real. And sometimes we find jewelry. Tiny pieces, rings too small for an adult hand. A silver earring bent out of shape. A pewter brooch, its pin rusted, but its engraving still legible, a leaf, a name, a symbol of faith. Such items weren't thrown away. They were lost, perhaps while adjusting a cloak, perhaps while crouching in haste over a cold wooden seat. A hand fumbled, a gem slipped, and in that instant it was gone. No one would climb into the pit to retrieve it, so there it stayed, hidden, remembered only now, centuries later, as it's plucked from muck and rinsed gently by gloved hands. Other finds are even stranger. A wooden comb, its teeth worn by use. A knife handle, carved with initials. A single shoe, the leather still holding its shape. Even cloth, twisted and used as toilet rags likely, once part of a tunic or child's chemise, torn down and repurposed in the last stages of life. Some pits yielded game pieces, dice, marbles, tokens, things people fidgeted with, gambled with, passed time with, things they never meant to lose. And in a few, very rare cases, coins, dropped in haste, vanished without trace, reappearing now, tarnished but legible, bearing the head of a long-dead monarch, forgotten even in his own time. What's remarkable is not just the objects, but where they ended up. Because the latrine was not just a waste channel. It was the end of the line for all things physical. And so when we excavate one, we aren't just peering into a sewer. We're peering into a pocket of time that no one meant to preserve. What we find in the pit is not treasure, not in the usual sense, but it is rich. It is layered, and it is full of the quiet, nameless evidence of everyday existence. Not of kings, not of saints, but of someone. Someone who dropped a ring, a seed, a scrap of their life, and then simply moved on, reconstructing diets from human waste. It might seem strange, even a little absurd, that the contents of a centuries-old cesspit could tell us what someone had for dinner. But waste, especially human waste, tells the truth. Unfiltered, unpolished, unequivocal. What's thrown away says more than what's written down, because it isn't shaped for pride or memory or reputation. It's just what was. And in the dark, sealed pockets of medieval privies, those truths remain. Archaeologists and paleobotanists, those who study ancient plant remains, have found that fecal material, once it's compacted and protected from air, can preserve for centuries. Not just in fossilized form, but often still soft and layered, like a cold earthen log book. Within it lie tiny fragments: seeds, pollen grains, fruit skins, vegetable fibers, bone shards, fish scales, and more. These traces, indigestible or semi-digestible, allow modern scientists to reconstruct medieval diets in surprising detail. Let's begin with grains, the backbone of the medieval diet. Wheat, rye, barley, oats. Bread was eaten daily by everyone, but the type of grain could vary enormously. The wealthy preferred fine white bread, sifted to remove the bran. The poor ate darker loaves, coarse, heavy, often mixed with beans or even ground acorns when grain was scarce. From waste, we find the husks, the bran, the burned crusts discarded near ovens. Pulses and legumes also show up: lentils, peas, broad beans. These were staple foods for the working class, especially during fasting days when meat was forbidden. And there are the fruits: apples, plums, damsons, blackberries, elderberries. Their seeds survive digestion. In fact, some pits have yielded such concentrations of cherry and plum stones that they suggest seasonal gluts, moments when fruit was abundant and briefly overwhelming the diet. Then there's the vegetable matter: cabbage, leeks, onions, garlic, bits of fibrous stalks and skin, carrot tops, even traces of herbs: parsley, fennel, mustard seed, used for both flavor and medicine. Meat, of course, is harder to trace directly through fecal analysis. But bone shards, small, splintered, often gnawed, tell part of the story. Pits near wealthier homes often show more animal remains: beef, pork, lamb, while poorer districts reveal more fish bones, especially herring and eel cheap, plentiful and portable. Sometimes fish were eaten, bones and all, especially when dried or smoked, and fragments show up deep in the waste. And then there are parasites. Yes, even these leave their trace. Eggs of intestinal worms, whipworm, roundworm, tapeworm, appear under the microscope like tiny symmetrical ovals. These infestations were common and expected, especially where sanitation was poor and food was eaten quickly, often undercooked. Their presence tells us not just what people ate, but how they lived, how they cooked, how clean their hands were, whether their water was safe. And in some cases, diet reveals status. A cesspit in a monastery might contain no meat at all, only fish, vegetables, and grains. A pick behind a merchant's house might show exotic seeds like coriander, or figs suggesting trade, luxury, and reach. A tenement latrine might reveal mostly bread and ale residues, simple, repeatable, caloric staples. Over time, patterns emerge. And suddenly, we are not just imagining medieval people eating, we are watching them. We can picture the pot on the fire, the child spitting a plum stone into the corner, the worker biting into a crust too thick to chew, the last spoonful of pottage scraped from the bowl. And when they were done, all of it, the food, the effort, the fuel, the fragments, made its way into the privy, where, hundreds of years later, it waited, not to nourish again, but to speak, quietly, truthfully, without shame. The mystery of the giant medieval dung heaps. In the margins of medieval cities, Beyond the last row of houses, just past the market walls or riverbanks, there once rose strange mounds. Massive, reeking, ever-growing piles of filth. They weren't hidden. They weren't ignored. In fact, they were named. In London, it was called the Mount of Dung, or sometimes, more colorfully, Leicester Hill. In Paris, La Voirie, near Montfaucon Tower, became a landmark in itself. In other towns, they were simply known as the heaps or the bank, words that implied not ruin, but accumulation. And that's what they were. Accumulations of everything the city cast off. Not just human waste, though there was plenty of that, but also animal dung, butchery scraps, rotted produce, broken pottery, ashes, straw, used wool, bones, spoiled bread, and even clothing too stained to clean. 1,000 small decisions to discard, layered one atop the other until they formed hills unnatural, but entirely man-made. Some grew so large they changed the city's topography, forming low rises in otherwise flat terrain. Others became unofficial landmarks used in directions. Just east of the Dung Hill, before the Leicester, beyond the pile. But why were these heaps left to grow? Why not remove them? The answer is both simple and strange. Because they were useful. And because no one wanted to touch them more than they had to. Dung was, in its own foul way, a commodity. Farmers outside the cities would sometimes come to purchase or collect the waste, using it as fertilizer. Tanners, those who softened hides, used dog dung and human urine to treat leather. Even fullers, who cleaned and whitened cloth, made use of night soil in their vats. But not all waste could be reused. And much of it simply sat, especially during times of illness or high mortality, when demand dropped and danger increased. The result? Towering masses, layered with the seasons. In summer, they steamed. In winter, they hardened, cracking like clay. In spring, they grew fed by runoff and new refuse. The smell shifted with the wind, sometimes reaching neighborhoods that could not afford distance. Attempts were made to regulate them. In London, laws were passed limiting how long waste could remain within the city walls. Butchers were forbidden from dumping entrails near the gates. Tanners were ordered to dispose of their vats away from the public. Gong farmers were instructed to cart their collections to the outer fields, to add to the heaps, not clog the streets. But enforcement was uneven. And so the heaps grew, year after year. Stratigraphy, the study of layers in soil, reveals their story. The bottom layers are black, compact, dense. Above that, scraps of bone and burned straw. Higher still, fragments of ceramic, flecks of glass, shards of cooking pots. At the top, coins, shoes, child-sized knives, tools too damaged to fix. Even pagan offerings have been found. Charms, amulets, tiny carved faces. Perhaps tossed in by those hoping to ward off the sicknesses the heaps were said to birth. Today, most of these heaps are gone. Cleared, built over, forgotten. But some remain in the earth flattened, but present. In parts of Paris, developers still find odd patches of soil, rich in phosphorus and animal fats. In London, near Clerkenwell, the ground runs thick with greasy clay that no longer drains properly. And in both cities, archaeologists dig carefully, layer by layer, uncovering not just waste, but rhythm, a pulse, a cycle, a city breathing out, again and again, into its own margins. And those heaps? They may be gone, but the stories they held and the lives they supported remain, not in gold, but in rot. The wooden toilet seat, surprisingly common. To imagine a medieval latrine is to picture something crude, perhaps a hole in the ground, a crumbling stone trench, or a wooden bench suspended over a pit. But archaeologists have discovered something unexpected beneath the soil of long-forgotten privies. Toilet seats, real ones, crafted from wood, worn smooth by centuries of very human use. They were not symbolic. They were not decorative. They were practical, functional, and surprisingly standardized. Most of these seats were made from thick planks of oak or elm, durable woods that could resist damp and warping. They were cut into squares or rectangles, roughly the width of a sitting adult, and featured a single round or oval hole carefully carved, sanded along the edges, and occasionally reinforced with wooden braces beneath. Some were built into privy benches, set into wooden frames within small chambers attached to homes, or built over cesspits in backyards. Others were discovered atop communal latrine trenches, where multiple holes were cut side by side, evidence of shared facilities, often used by tenants or servants. Yes, shared seating, without partition or privacy, just a row of holes, spaced at intervals, over a long pit. It sounds alien to us now, but in the Middle Ages, the concept of personal privacy, especially when it came to bodily functions, was vastly different. Modesty existed, but not in the solitary, locked-door rituals we now know. Life was lived in close quarters, and defecation, like eating, praying, or sleeping, was often a communal act. Some latrine seats had two holes, side by side, possibly for a parent and child, or simply for practicality. A few were cut with smaller openings, suggesting use by children or perhaps women, though such distinctions were rare and inconsistent. And they weren't just planks balanced on stone. They were fitted, installed, and occasionally even hinged, allowing them to be lifted for cleaning or replaced when worn. We know this because many seats have been recovered intact, preserved in anaerobic conditions, deep within cesspits where oxygen could not rot the wood. They emerge now from the soil-darkened, but recognizably crafted evidence of carpentry, devoted not to beauty, but to necessity. In excavations under medieval London, York, and even Trondheim in Norway, dozens of such seats have been uncovered. Some still bear tool marks, joint notches, and even decorative edges, simple flourishes carved into corners, perhaps to add a touch of comfort or pride to even this most humble of furnishings. To sit on one would have felt familiar, not comfortable exactly, but solid, reassuring. A small slab of craftsmanship in the midst of bodily chaos. And beneath it always a pit, sometimes lined, sometimes open to the soil, sometimes nearly full. And when the smell rose too high, when the contents neared the seat, someone was called to remove it. Enter the Gong farmer, the silent companion to the toilet seat, the one who made sure the luxury of sitting didn't become a public disaster. Because while medieval people didn't speak of hygiene as we do, they knew. They knew the difference between bearable and unbearable, between living with waste and drowning in it. And so, even something as simple as a toilet seat became part of that equation. Not a throne, but a tool, a square of wood between a person and the pit. And now, centuries later, unearthed from the filth they once served, they tell us something intimate, that even then, even when the world stank, people still sought comfort where they could, even in the small, round hole carved carefully into a plank. Animal waste versus human waste, a municipal nightmare. In the crowded maze of a medieval city, filth did not have a single source. People, yes, but also pigs, horses, cattle, dogs, chickens, and in some quarters goats, sheep, even ducks waddling through the alleys, leaving small wet trails behind them. Where there was life, there was waste. And in cities that pulsed with trade, movement, and livestock at every turn, that waste was everywhere. Human refuse may have ended in cesspits and latrines structured, if imperfect, attempts at control. But animal waste? That was a different story. It came in volume, constantly, and from creatures that moved freely through the streets, leaving behind a trail that was both normal and a logistical nightmare. Let's begin with the horses. Every cart, every carriage, every mounted official, every form of medieval land transport ran on four-legged engines that dropped waste wherever they pleased. A single horse can produce up to 15 kilos of manure a day. And in a city with hundreds, even thousands of horses, the result was substantial. Streets became slick with dung. Flies gathered in clouds. And in warm months, the air grew thick, not just with smell, but with pathogens stirred up by every passing wheel. Oxen, used for heavier loads, added to the burden. They were larger, slower, and no cleaner. Then there were pigs, often kept by poorer residents in urban yards, or allowed to roam semi-freely in outlying neighborhoods. They scavenged refuse, overturning baskets and rooting through market scraps. But they also relieved themselves in doorways, cellars, and near food stalls. In fact, pigs were so prolific in some towns that specific bylaws were passed banning them from certain streets during daylight, not for cleanliness, but because they occasionally tripped citizens or attacked children. Dogs owned and stray added to the mix. They slept in doorways, followed fishmongers, barked through markets, and left droppings in corners. No one cleaned up after them. Why would they? Chickens and ducks, though less problematic by volume, contributed their own smears and stains, especially near well pumps, where people fetched water through mudslick with animal residue. So how did cities deal with this mess? Sometimes they didn't. In poorer districts, animal waste simply built up mixed with ash, straw, and rainwater, forming a kind of brown mulch that covered walkways. Children played in it. Women trudged through it carrying buckets. Merchants laid planks down over especially wet stretches. But in better organized cities, something had to be done. Enter the muck collectors, rakers, and street sweepers men, tasked with dragging the refuse to the edge of town, to dung heaps or lastels, where it was dumped and sometimes sold as fertilizer. Cities like London and Paris even passed laws assigning responsibility for street cleanliness to certain parishes or neighborhoods. Merchants were required to clear the space in front of their shops. Homeowners might be fined for failing to sweep the alley near their privy. And some cities banned the stabling of animals within certain walls entirely, though such laws were hard to enforce. And still, the filth remained, because it never stopped coming. Day after day, step after step, human waste, at least, went somewhere. Animal waste simply kept appearing, a relentless tide of dung that made city life, especially in summer, a noisy, smelly, insect-ridden challenge. Today, when we unearth medieval street layers, we find the evidence. Traces of hoofprints pressed into compacted dung. Fossilized layers of straw, mixed with manure, used to soak up puddles. Bits of chewed hay, half digested, scattered among pottery shards. And in that waste, a record of how cities truly lived. Not in clean halls or tidy squares, but ankle-deep in a compromise with the animals that kept them alive and dirtied them every step of the way. Evidence of Gong farmers in guild records. For a long time, the Gong farmer left no trace. He worked at night. He lived at the margins. He wasn't the kind of man whose name was carved in stone or sung in ballads. But cities are built on systems of labor, taxes, fines, and permits. And in the paper trails of medieval bureaucracy, even the low-list workers left a shadow. That's where we begin to find him. In the guild rolls, the corp records, the parish accounts, and the city ledgers. Not celebrated, not detailed, but there. In London, the Gong farmers, sometimes called nightmen, scavengers, or muckrakers, began appearing in official documentation by the 13th century. These weren't casual mentions. They were part of municipal contracts, payment agreements, and even legal disputes. They appear in guild records, though not as part of prestigious crafts like the weavers, goldsmiths, or carpenters. Rather, they existed as part of the lesser trades, the unglamorous but essential roles without halls or feasts or coats of arms. They were sometimes grouped with other, unclean professions: tanners, executioners, knackers, and leech collectors. Trades that dealt with death, waste, or what society preferred to forget. In the London City Rolls, we find evidence of payments made to nightmen contracted by the municipality. They were hired by ward, assigned to specific neighborhoods, and given routes and schedules, often under the supervision of local aldermen. Records show agreed-upon prices for suspect clearing: 4 pence for the emptying of a pit behind Fish Lane, or 12 pence for removal of the muck from St. John's Yard. We even find penalties levied against homeowners who refused to pay or who attempted to dump their waste illegally instead of hiring a gong farmer. In these fines, the nightman's name might be referenced, usually only once, usually misspelled, and always briefly. More rarely, we find their names appear in court records. Disputes over payment. Allegations of dumped waste in the wrong location. Occasionally, physical altercations with citizens who refused access to a pit. In one record from Norwich, a nightman named John Lemucker sued a merchant for non-payment after clearing a privy behind his home. The court ruled in his favor. The entry reads, "Let the merchant be made to pay 2 shillings to John, the muckman, for his labor, and let none obstruct the same henceforth." That's it. That's the whole record. But it tells us so much. It tells us these men had rights, limited though they were. It tells us they operated within the city's systems, even if their labor was rarely honored aloud. And it tells us that even at the lowest rung of society, a man could demand recognition, if only for a job most wouldn't touch. Some cities had official lists of licensed gong farmers, not to honor them, but to keep track, to ensure the waste went where it was supposed to prevent the spread of disease, to regulate access to lastels, the dumping grounds outside the city. These lists tell us about the scope of the job. In a city like London, dozens of men were needed to manage the flow of human waste from thousands of households. And occasionally, we glimpse more personal details. An apprentice listed under a master nightman. A partnership dissolved due to age or illness. A widow taking over the license after her husband's death. Brief mentions. Barely more than a name. But in those names lies a reminder that the city did not clean itself. That behind every clean street, every emptied pit, every delay of plague or rot, there was a hand, a real, tired, filthy hand that did the work. And for all their silence, for all the blank spots in the history books, the guild records remember them. If only faintly. If only in ink. If only when they were owed coin. Sanitation laws. Early signs of health awareness. In a world without germ theory, without antibiotics or antiseptics, it would be easy to assume that medieval people simply lived in filth unaware, unconcerned, resigned to the reek of their cities and the risk of disease. But that would be a mistake, because while they didn't understand why waste made people sick, they understood that it did. They saw the patterns, how bad smells preceded mad health, how waste-ridden neighborhoods suffered more during outbreaks, how cleaner wells, cleaner streets, cleaner air seemed somehow safer. And out of that awareness grew something remarkable: law. Even in the early medieval period, cities began to pass ordinances regulating filth, not because they knew about bacteria, but because they knew what happened when filth was ignored. These were pragmatic laws shaped by experience. In 12th century Paris, a royal decree forbade butchers from dumping animal waste into the Seine. Tanners were pushed to the city's edges, not out of cruelty, but because the stench of ammonia and rotting flesh was unbearable to neighbors. Barbers and surgeons were required to dispose of bloody water away from public walkways. In London, by the 14th century, sanitation had become part of civic governance. City officials known as scavengers or rakers were tasked with monitoring waste in the streets. They levied fines on those who emptied chamber pots into open gutters during the day. Households were told to build sealed cesspits or risk prosecution. Some of the laws seem shockingly modern in tone. A 1371 ordinance reads, "No person shall cause their privy to overflow into the common street, under penalty of 6 pence. Another, let all dung be removed by night and placed no closer to the public street than 2 rods. And in some cases, laws extended to construction. New homes were required to include latrines, sometimes shared between households, sometimes private. In towns like Lübeck or Ghent, city bylaws demanded that cesspits be a certain depth and built with proper linings, so waste did not seep into surrounding foundations or wells. They even created designated dumping hours. In many towns, human and animal waste could only be carted out after sunset to avoid disrupting trade and to minimize public disgust. And while enforcement was inconsistent, corruption, laziness, or lack of manpower often hindered results, the laws themselves were a sign of understanding. An understanding that waste could be managed, that smell could signal sickness, that cities had limits, and without regulation, they would rot from within. We see evidence of this in parish records, where communities pooled resources to build public latrines or hired gong farmers collectively to manage waste. We see it in court fines levied against citizens who failed to maintain their cesspits or who dumped refuse too close to wells. And we see it in manuals written not for physicians, but for city officials outlining best practices for waste removal, pit construction, and street cleaning. Were these laws perfect? Far from it. But they reveal something important, that medieval people were not ignorant of hygiene. They simply lacked the tools to fully control it. And yet, with what they had, with shovels and buckets, fines and guilds, they built the beginnings of public health. The smell told them what science had yet to prove. And from that smell, they wrote rules. Not because they knew what lurked in the filth, but because they knew enough to care. How towns tried to stay clean. The medieval town was not passive in the face of filth. It was not indifferent. It tried again and again to clean itself, to regulate the chaos of waste, to push back the creeping stench. But those efforts, no matter how determined, often ended in failure, because medieval cities were working against forces too large to tame with just a rake and a bylaw. Let's begin with infrastructure. Most medieval towns did not have complex sewer systems, not because they lacked the will, but because they lacked the means. They didn't have the engineering knowledge or the labor force to build underground drainage on a citywide scale. Instead, many relied on open drainage ditches, carved along the sides of streets, called kennels. These channels carried rainwater, gray water, and occasionally chamber pot contents downhill, usually into a nearby river, or sometimes just into another neighborhood. These ditches quickly clogged with leaves, straw, bits of food, and dung. Without regular maintenance, they overflowed, turning cobbled lanes into putrid rivulets. City officials posted fines for blocking drains, but who would enforce them, and who would pay? Then there were the cesspits. Every household had to deal with its own waste, and most built pits in the back garden or beneath their homes. Some were carefully constructed, stone-lined, sealed, designed to be emptied, but many were not. A poorly made pit could leak into the ground, especially in wet weather. When it rained heavily, some pits would flood upward, spilling into homes or mixing with well water. There are written complaints, preserved in court records, of neighbors accusing each other of building latrines too close to shared walls or pathways. Public latrines did exist, usually near market squares, churches, or bridges. But they were communal, often unattended, and quickly became overwhelmed. Without staff to clean them, they were either abandoned or became sites of frequent dumping, graffiti, or even crime. To manage this, towns hired gong farmers, rakers, and scavengers, who removed waste at night and carted it to the outskirts. They were essential, but often underpaid, and their work depended on weather, manpower, and civic funds. During plague years or times of famine, these services collapsed. Workers fled, bodies piled up. Cesspits went unemptied for weeks. The city's waste management, already fragile, failed completely. We also see towns trying to enforce behavioral rules. Bans on throwing refuse into the street. Curfews for dumping. Regulations for where animals could be slaughtered, or where soap makers could dispose of lye and fat. But with thousands of citizens, minimal surveillance, and a public that often viewed officials with distrust, these laws were easy to ignore. Some towns tried creative solutions. They built raised wooden walkways to keep pedestrians above the filth. They created rotating cleanup crews, made of citizens drafted like jurors. A few experimented with composting waste in designated yards, mixing human and animal manure with straw and leaves to break down into fertilizer. But these systems required coordination, trust, and money, three things that were often in short supply. And so the waste returned, not because no one cared, but because the fight was simply too big. Every cart that passed left droppings. Every home that cooked tossed scraps. Every family that ate had to relieve itself. The waste was relentless, and the town's tools were finite. They tried to stay clean. They made laws, they hired men. They built pits and poured vinegar and chased pigs out of markets. But in the end, the filth always found a way back in. And now, as archaeologists dig into those layers, stone, clay, muck, then more muck, they don't find laziness. They find persistence. Evidence that these people, without science or sanitation, still tried daily to live in a world just slightly cleaner than the day before. Feasting while others shovel. Life in a medieval noble's hall. A typical noble banquet. 7 courses of roasted everything. Now we rise figuratively and socially from the pits and trenches below the city, and enter the high-ceilinged world of the medieval noble's great hall. The contrast is immediate. The air smells not of rot and ammonia, but of roasted meats, spiced sauces, and beeswax candles. The noise here is lively, the echo of cups clinking, hounds barking, minstrels plucking lutes, servants rushing to and fro. To sit at a noble's table in the 14th or 15th century was not just to eat, it was to perform status. A banquet was a social theater, every course an act, every plate a symbol. Let's imagine one such feast, perhaps in a wealthy estate in northern France or the English countryside. Guests arrive at dusk, seated according to rank, not just by who they are, but by who they are not. The closer to the Lord, the more important you are. The farther down the table, the closer you are to the doors, the draft, and the interruptions from servants. Dinner begins with pottage, a thick stew of grains, meat, and vegetables. Then comes roast capon, perhaps glazed with honey and wine. Next, a whole fish, prepared in almond milk and herbs. Then a platter of small birds, larks or thrushes, delicately plucked. A dish of frumenty, a kind of sweet, creamy wheat pudding, is next. Following that, roasted venison, spiced and sliced for sharing. And finally, a custard tart, accompanied by dried figs, nuts, and mulled wine. Each dish is lavish not just in flavor, but in scarcity. Sugar is rare. Spices like cinnamon, saffron, and cloves come from oceans away. Meat is served in generous cuts, while much of the population might go weeks without it. And the bread? It's not for eating, at least not all of it. Thick slices of coarse bread called trenchers serve as edible plates. After the meal, these are gathered and given to servants, the poor, or even dogs. Music plays, gestures perform, the Lord gives a toast. The hall glows with warmth, smoke from the hearth rising through a louvered opening in the ceiling. It all feels distant from the cesspits and dung heaps. But the truth is, every single course will leave something behind. Bones, scraps, liquids, shells, oils. And beneath this hall, often quite literally in the cellars or the yards, someone will be responsible for removing it. Because even here, in luxury, waste accumulates. And when the candles are snuffed, and the guests retire to chambers with chamber pots, the other side of the banquet begins. The scraping, the dumping, the shoveling. Tomorrow's sunrise brings the servants with buckets. And the cycle feast above, filth below continues. The food waste problem no one addressed. At first glance, the medieval noble's table appears as a triumph of abundance, plentiful meats, fine wines, fresh-baked breads, sweet preserves, and exotic spices. It was a performance of wealth, power, and divine favor. The richer the lord, the more food he could afford to not eat. And therein lies the problem. So much of it was never meant to be eaten at all. The sheer volume of food prepared for a feast, whether a holy day banquet, a visiting dignitary's dinner, or even a seasonal celebration, was staggering. Chefs, known as cooks of the hall or masters of the kitchen, were instructed to err on the side of excess. Better to have too much than risk dishonor through scarcity. Every course was accompanied by dozens of small dishes, many untouched, uneaten, and discarded. Imagine a single evening's feast at a minor baron's estate. A table groaning beneath, whole roasted peacocks, rabbit pies laced with cloves and nutmeg, bowls of spiced stewed fruits, and pastries shaped like swans or castles. Each of these came with expectations. The lord might sample a bite or two, praise the seasoning, and move on. Guests did the same. By the end of the evening, more than half the food remained. But what became of it? Some was distributed leftovers, carved into portions for servants. Others were tossed into scrap bins, or gathered in baskets and dumped into midden heaps, the waste piles located behind kitchens or stables. The bones, sauces, stale bread, and skins of uneaten fruit created a soft, sludgy layer of rot that attracted rats, flies, and disease. Grease and drippings from roasting spits were swept into trenches. Tankards of half-finished ale, too sour to be kept, were poured out into the yard. Worse still, trenchers, those slabs of stale bread used as makeshift plates, were often saturated with gravy, meat juice, and oils. Some were gifted to the poor. Others were deemed too filthy to salvage and thrown into waste bins. Food waste from these halls made its way into privy drains, gutters, and cesspits, especially in winter, when open midden heaps grew too foul to approach. Even bones from banquets' large haunches, poultry carcasses, fish skeletons appear in the archaeological record, found buried deep in the layers of refuse near castles and manors, sometimes piled in corners, sometimes burned, occasionally dumped directly into moats, which became fetid catch basins for both rainwater and garbage. This problem wasn't just aesthetic, it was sanitary. The combination of animal parts, dairy, and sweets created the perfect breeding ground for insects, maggots in meat, flies clustering around fruit peels, rats tearing into meat pies left on scraps, and always the smell not quite human waste, but close enough to invite illness. No coordinated solution existed. There were no composting programs, no concept of refrigerated storage, no centralized city waste service for nobles. Even the wealthiest halls had only so many hands to clean, and most efforts were focused on preparing the next meal, not responsibly disposing of the last. Food that should have been preserved was wasted. Food that could have fed the hungry was allowed to rot. And food that should have been buried carefully was often dumped where it would seep, stink, and spread. All this simply because feasting was not about nourishment. It was about showing you could afford not to care. And so, while servants scraped bones into barrels and dumped pottage into ditches, while dogs fought over spoiled trenchers, and cats picked fish bones from filth, the upper halls resumed their planning for the next banquet. The cycle of waste continued, and all the while, just outside the window, a different sort of worker, a nightman or gong farmer, prepared to shovel away the consequences, serving from trenchers and tossing bones to dogs. At the medieval noble's table, elegance and excess walked hand in hand, but so did improvisation and waste. Unlike our modern notions of plates and utensils, the medieval feast relied on trencher bread, a thick, stale slice of coarse, usually several days old wheat bread used not for eating, but for serving. Picture the scene. A great oak table laid with freshly roasted meats, steaming stews, and soft cheeses, all arranged not on porcelain or pewter, but on flat loaves about 4 to 6 inches thick, hardened at the crust, soft enough at the center to soak in grease and sauce. Each guest had one. It was a vessel, a sponge, and eventually a discard. At first, trenchers seemed like a clever solution. No washing required. Simply toss out the used bread. But that convenience came at a cost. The food placed atop trenchers was often heavily sauced, a display of wealth, since spices and sugars were costly imports. With no forks in widespread use, nobles used knives, spoons, and more often than not their fingers. Meat juices, fruit syrups, and sticky gravies soaked deep into the bread, creating a kind of sodden, dripping platform by the meal's end. The result? An inedible, oil-slicked slab of bread, now half melted beneath roasted goose or beef stew. Occasionally, trenchers were carved up and handed to household servants an edible, if unappetizing, form of compensation. More often, they were tossed aside, heaped into baskets, and discarded behind the kitchens or in the midden heaps. And if trenchers were food for humans, bones were for dogs. Every banquet featured large portions of meat, legs of mutton, ribs of pork, roasted game birds, and with them came bones of every size. Nobles, seated at the high table, thought little of waste. Once the meat had been gnawed or carved, the remains were flung casually to the floor. Below the table, in the shadows, dogs waited. These were not pampered lapdogs. They were lean, muscled, often half-wild hounds used for hunting or guarding, allowed indoors during feasts as a form of clean-up crew. Guests thought little of stepping around them. Bones flew. Dogs scrambled. A cracked knuckle here, a growl there. No one paid much attention. The practice was expected. Dogs were part of the banquet rhythm, but they were also a hygiene hazard. They licked trenchers. They dragged bones through the hall. They relieved themselves behind the tapestries or in corners. And yet, because they were convenient and entertaining, they remained. What didn't go to dogs went to pigs or waste collectors, depending on the estate. Some lords arranged for leftovers to be collected and distributed to local poorhouses. Others simply allowed the filth to pile up in the yards until nightmen came to collect it, if they were hired at all. But for all the structure and ceremony of noble dining, what became clear was this: the system was never meant to be clean. It was designed for display, not for sustainability, not for sanitation, not even for full consumption. Trenchers were soaked and tossed. Bones were snapped and flown. Dogs licked floors clean. And servants, when the feast was over, gathered the remains, not with reverence, but with brooms and buckets. The pageantry above depended on the acceptance of filth below. And no matter how refined the table setting or how delicate the lute playing, someone would always be responsible for scraping the mess into darkness. Chamber pots upstairs, Gong farmers below. As elegant as a noble household appeared in candlelight, with its carved staircases and velvet drapery, it was a place that, like all medieval homes, had one inescapable reality. Everyone had to relieve themselves. And in castles, manors, and noble townhouses, this most human of needs was addressed not by distance or plumbing, but by proximity. Specifically, the chamber pot. If you lived in luxury in the 13th or 14th century, your bedroom likely had no ensuite latrine. Instead, it had a pot ceramic, pewter, or even gilded if you were particularly grand, that sat beneath the bed, behind a screen, or tucked discreetly in a corner. When nature called, you used it. If you were ill or simply too important to walk far, you might even use it without leaving your bed at all. In the morning, or after a meal, or in the middle of the night, a servant, usually the lowest-ranked chambermaid or boy, would be tasked with the disposal. Now multiply that task by the number of rooms in the manor. Dozens of bedrooms. Scores of guests after a banquet. A household that included not only the noble family, but squires, ladies-in-waiting, stewards, tutors, and clergy. And each of them, no matter how noble, produced waste. Where did it all go? In some castles, a handful of privy towers or garderobes existed narrow, vertical shafts built into outer walls, which allowed waste to drop into a pit, a moat, or even directly onto the ground below. These were architectural afterthoughts, often shared by many and placed far from the sleeping quarters. Convenient? Not especially. So chamber pots persisted. And when they filled, especially after feasts, they were emptied into cesspits, gutters, or directly into the castle's waste shaft. But the sheer volume of this night soil, as it was politely called, overwhelmed these systems. This is where the Gong farmer re-enters the story. Though most commonly associated with urban cesspits, Gong farmers were also contracted by noble households, particularly during the summer months or following large gatherings. They arrived at dawn or dusk, entering through back gates, never the front. They carried buckets, wooden scrapers, torches, and strong stomachs. Their task? To descend into castle pits, sometimes through access holes beneath the garderobes, and manually shovel the waste into carts or barrels. Other times, they were handed baskets of waste collected from chamber pots, stacked high and still warm, which they carried on broad yokes across their shoulders. The smell was inescapable. So was the weight. A full chamber pot could weigh several pounds. Dozens of them, in one day, meant hundreds of pounds carried up and down stairs, across courtyards, through narrow back hallways slick with grease or worse. And the danger? It lingered everywhere. Wet stone steps, collapsing cesspit floors, the risk of inhaling gases from decomposing matter, night air, was very real and was feared for its association with disease. One misstep in a confined shaft and a Gong farmer could disappear without a sound. His body recovered only when the waste was cleared weeks later. What's striking is the disconnect. Above, nobles dined on fig-stuffed pheasant, relieved themselves in comfort, and called for a servant when done. Below, in torchlight, a man with a rope and a bucket carried it all away, unseen, unspoken of, but utterly essential. He could not use the front gate. He could not speak at the high table. He could not, in some households, even walk upright within the halls, required instead to bow low or wear a badge to signify his role. And yet, without him, the castle would drown in its own indulgence. The contrast was complete. Silk above, sludge below. The quiet clink of goblets upstairs, the sloshing of waste into barrels down in the courtyard. Every pot filled was a promise that someone else, someone lower, would take care of the mess. And every Gong farmer, as he heaved another basket onto his back, knew just how far that promise reached, from chamber to pit, from luxury to filth, from one class to another. Lavish meals, rotten consequences. The medieval noble's hall was a space of spectacle where meat was roasted over open flames. Spices imported from distant shores were sprinkled generously, and banquets unfolded like orchestrated performances of power and privilege. But for every glistening boar's head paraded into the hall, every candied fig passed between silk-gloved fingers, a trail of waste and rot grew quietly in the shadows. Because medieval kitchens, even the best appointed ones, lacked the means to store, preserve, or dispose of food at the scale that feasting demanded. Let's follow the path of a single feast. A cook prepares dozens of courses: goose stuffed with herbs, pies encased in butter-rich crusts, veal in almond milk, salted eels, sugared dates. The food is delivered steaming hot into the great hall, where it is carved and served in succession. Nobles pick at dishes, favoring a bite or two, some courses more for decoration than nutrition. And when the guests retire, what's left is more than scraps, it's mountains. Unfinished trenchers soaked in grease, sausages that sat too long, roasted game beginning to turn at the bone, custards separating under their skin. Servants scramble to separate the salvageable from the spoiled. Leftovers are sometimes sent to retainers or shared among staff. But what can't be used, especially during hot months, begins to rot within hours. The smell gathers first in the kitchens, a warm sourness, subtle at first, then inescapable. Without refrigeration or even consistent cool cellars, food began to turn the moment it was cooked. Fish and dairy were especially vulnerable. Meat, often left hanging in pantries before serving, might already be half-rancid. And what of the waste itself? There were no tidy garbage bins, no municipal collection. Instead, kitchen refuse was thrown into midden heaps piles of organic waste located behind the kitchens, beside the stables, or near the garden wall. These middens were alive, crawling with maggots, attracting rats and crows, leaking juices into nearby soil. When rain came, the heaps turned to black slurry that ran through courtyards. In summer, they swelled with heat and steamed faintly in the morning sun. The air near them was dense, unpleasant, and clung to clothing. If too close to the castle's living quarters, this waste could be lethal. The association between smell and sickness was not yet scientifically understood, but it was suspected. Households placed sweet herbs near windows, hung dried lavender or rosemary to cleanse the air, but these were cosmetic solutions. Sometimes the worst consequences came not from what was seen, but what festered invisibly. Contaminated water, when runoff from waste piles seeped into wells. Insect-borne illness, as flies bred in refuse, then landed on bread or cloth. Spoiled meat passed off as fresh, especially in lean times when no food could be spared. The cooks and kitchen boys were the first to know when food turned. The lords were usually the last until they grew ill. Even then, blame might fall on sorcery, or sin, or stars, not on the simple truth of rotting food left too long in the sun. In wealth, the noble class insulated themselves from many dangers. But waste does not respect status. No matter how finely the hall was decorated, or how richly dressed the guests, rot crept in through cracks, down the drains, across the floors, into the bread. And when a noble fell ill from food poisoning called surfeit or humor imbalance, there was no understanding that the feast itself may have been to blame. In time, many castles added drainage channels, built more distant middens, or expanded kitchens to allow food to cool more quickly. But these were patches, not solutions. Because when food is abundance and power is performance, waste becomes invisible until it isn't, until the stench rises to the stairwells, until the dogs refuse to eat what's been served, until the flies begin to circle the fruit before the hands do. The feast, in all its glory, left a second legacy, a slow, sour aftermath of decay, cleaned up quietly by the same hands that prepared the luxury. The kitchen boys and spit-turners, mini-jobs within the estate. Beneath the noble feasts and towering roasts was a small army of workers, many of them children or young teens, whose lives revolved entirely around the heat, noise, and grime of the castle kitchens. If the great hall was the stage for aristocratic display, the kitchen was the engine room, and its lowest-ranking cogs were the kitchen boys and spit-turners. Their jobs were simple, but exhausting, and often painful. Let's begin with the spit-turner, known in French as enfant de cuisine, literally child of the kitchen. The name was apt, as many of these roles were filled by young boys, often orphans or children of the estate's servants. Starting from the age of 7 or 8, they were given one task: turn the spit. Turn it slowly, turn it constantly. Never stop turning it, not even for a moment. Large haunches of meat boar, deer, beef, or whole pigs were suspended on iron rods over open flames. These spits were not mechanized. They relied on human effort, or in rare cases, dog-powered treadmills. Most of the time, it was a boy squatting by the hearth, gripping the iron handle, his arms aching, his eyes watering from smoke, his skin blistering from heat. He couldn't walk away. He couldn't fall asleep. If the meat scorched on one side or was left raw on the other, the punishment would be swift and humiliating beatings, public scolding, or demotion to chamber latrine duty. The hearth was sweltering. There was no ventilation, only a high chimney above to funnel smoke. Sparks flew, grease splattered, and all around him the rush of cooks, chopping, basting, barking orders, while the boy kept turning and turning, sometimes for 6 to 8 hours without rest. Meanwhile, the kitchen boys, just slightly older, were given every other task not deemed skilled. They scrubbed pots with sand and rags. They hauled barrels of water from wells. They chopped onions, plucked feathers from poultry, scaled fish, swept floors, and fetched herbs from gardens. During a banquet, they scurried between the great hall and the scullery like ghosts in homespun tunics, often barefoot, silent unless spoken to. They were not allowed to speak at table, never to touch food meant for nobles, and were expected to be invisible unless summoned. Their sleeping quarters were usually a straw mat near the pantry or a shared room near the stables. Their meals were sparse, leftover pottage, crusts, and kitchen scraps. Their clothing? Hand-me-downs, stained with grease and soot, sleeves too short, shoes if they were lucky. But make no mistake, they were vital. Without them, the fires went cold. The plates stayed dirty. The platters never reached the high table. The kitchen was a hierarchy unto itself. The master cook, often trained in a noble household or monastery, who oversaw the entire operation. The scullions, who cleaned and prepped. The bakers, brewers, butchers, and carvers, each with a defined specialty. And at the very bottom, the kitchen boys and spit-turners too low to rise, too necessary to ignore. They lived among the smells of onions and ash. They woke before dawn and went to bed after midnight. Their ears rang with shouts, and their hands never quite lost the smell of lard and garlic. They were everywhere and nowhere, the silent force that kept the roast turning. And in every noble feast, beneath the gleam of silver platters and spice-dusted birds, there was the echo of a boy, arms burning, cheeks streaked with soot, still turning the meat, still waiting for someone to say, "That's enough for today." The secrecy of the privy chamber, tucked away in the farthest corners of a noble estate, behind thick oak doors and often accessible only through narrow side passages, was a space rarely spoken of outside elite circles, the privy chamber. Though the name might suggest merely a lavatory in the medieval noble world, it was far more than that. The privy chamber was both a physical room and a realm of privacy, reserved for the most personal, intimate aspects of noble life. It was where the lord or lady bathed, dressed, prayed in solitude, consulted physicians, and yes, relieved themselves. Unlike the bustling great hall or the chaotic kitchens, the privy chamber was a zone of silence. Only the most trusted servants, often called gentlemen of the privy chamber or ladies of the bedchamber, were permitted entry. These attendants knew every routine, managed clothing and grooming, and were responsible for the pot de chambre, the chamber pot, and its disposal. These pots ranged in design and material, from simple glazed earthenware to ornate gilded vessels, lined with fabric or straw for silence and comfort. And while the pot itself might gleam, its contents were no different from anyone else's. The difference lay in how those contents were treated. When used, the chamber pot would be quickly covered with a cloth lid, then carried, often hidden through servant corridors or back stairs, to be emptied in private. In some castles, secret chutes or waste shafts led directly from the chamber to a cesspit far below. But in many cases, the waste had to be carried by hand, in silence and without incident. These trips were timed carefully, never during meals, Never during public events. Never while guests were being escorted through the halls. And this wasn't just about hygiene, it was about appearances. A nobleman's authority relied, in part, on being above the bodily. To be seen sweating, limping, or needing relief was to be seen as vulnerable. Thus, the entire system was built to hide the evidence of humanness. If a spill occurred, silence. If a servant gagged or dropped the pot, they were dismissed. If the smell reached the corridor, the chamber was aired, herbs burned, and no word was spoken. The architecture reinforced this secrecy. Doors were padded to muffle sound. Privy rooms had small slits for ventilation, often near chimneys to carry odors upward. In some castles, entire towers were devoted to these functions, known as garderobes, with shafts running the height of the building to deposit waste into pits or moats. Still, even these designs required human hands to maintain. Waste pits filled, shafts clogged, odors seeped through cracks. And when they did, someone was summoned. A gong farmer, a nightman, a waste collector. Not from within the household, but from the outside, brought in under cover of night to clean what could not be acknowledged in daylight. These workers never saw the chamber itself. They accessed it from below, through wooden grates or stone vaults, scraping and hauling in silence. Meanwhile, above them, the privy chamber returned to its calm, fragrant quiet. The lord paced in slippers, dictating letters or examining ledgers. The lady adjusted her wimple before a polished bronze mirror. Neither gave thought to the labor beneath. That was the design. In a world where dignity was everything, the greatest luxury wasn't wealth or even comfort. It was the ability to forget your own filth and to know that someone else, silent and unseen, would take it away. Who cleaned the castle latrines? Outsourced filth. For all the grandeur of medieval castles with their stone towers, stained glass chapels, and banquet halls echoing with song, there was a less celebrated, more humbling reality built into their very foundations: the latrines. Known more politely as garderobes, these were the rudimentary toilets of the age-narrow vertical shafts built into castle walls, often projecting outward over a moat or cesspit, with a simple bench and a hole. But these shafts didn't clean themselves, and what fell into the pits below didn't magically vanish. So who cleaned them? The answer is as uncomfortable as the work itself. They outsourced it. The nobles, the stewards, even the castle cooks, they hired specialists. And these specialists, often from the fringes of society, were the gong farmers and nightmen of the countryside. Most castles did not employ full-time waste workers. Instead, they contracted locals, men paid by the job, to crawl into the muck under cover of night or during quiet hours of the day. This arrangement wasn't just practical, it was intentional. These men were considered too filthy, too unsavory, too stigmatized to be part of the regular household. And yet, their work was vital. Let's break down what that job entailed. 1. Accessing the pit. Many garderobes emptied into deep stone-lined cesspits beneath the castle walls. Access was often gained via a small wooden hatch, hidden behind the kitchens or within the outer bailey. A waste worker would arrive with a ladder, buckets, and long-handled scrapers, often assisted by a second man who stayed outside to haul loads. 2. Shoveling waste. The waste was thick, heavy, and semi-solid, a mixture of human excrement, food scraps, straw, animal droppings, and rainwater runoff. The smell was overpowering, the consistency difficult to work with, and the pits often infested with vermin. 3. Carrying it out. Once gathered into buckets, the contents had to be carried away from the castle, sometimes by cart, sometimes on foot. Where did it go? Often to nearby fields used, ironically, as fertilizer. Other times, it was dumped into designated waste trenches well outside castle walls. 4. Cleaning the walls and shaft. The stone walls of the garderobe chute were often coated in buildup. Workers used brushes, rags, and even sand or ash to scrape down the sides and disinfect with vinegar or lime. The work was physical, filthy, and incredibly dangerous. Pit collapses and asphyxiation from fumes were not uncommon. And all this was done in silence. They arrived at dusk. They worked through the night. They left before dawn. Their names were rarely recorded. Their presence rarely acknowledged. Even the payment was discreet, left in coin purses, handed through back doors, or recorded simply as waste clearing services. But castles didn't stop producing filth. Every meal, every guest, every chamber pot. So the work never ended. Some larger castles tried more permanent solutions. Double guardrabes for increased flow. Waste chutes angled over running water, in theory to wash away the filth. Constructed latrine towers, distant from the main halls, sometimes with a rudimentary flushing mechanism using collected rainwater. But these were innovations for the wealthy, the powerful, and even then, they required maintenance. Stone clogged. Drainage failed. Foul air seeped upward. So even the best designed latrine system would eventually demand one thing. A man in the dark, with a bucket on his knees, scraping centuries of privilege from stone. And when his job was done, no one clapped. No one thanked him. He was paid, dismissed, and forgotten. Because in a castle full of tapestries and torches, where nobility dreamed of immortality, someone still had to shovel the remains of yesterday. And someone always did. The hidden cost of cleanliness. And now, as the last torch burns low in the quiet corners of the castle, and the stone corridors fall silent once more, we step gently away from the shadows where our story has dwelled. You've walked tonight not through the glamorous halls of power, but along the winding paths behind them, where the unspeakable was carried by hand, and the invisible labor of the lowest kept the entire noble world upright. From the tight stone shafts of castle guardrabes to the soot-blackened hearths of kitchen boys, we have lingered in places history rarely shines its light. Because every golden goblet raised in toast, every silk-draped noble reclining after supper, every lavish course brought to table with ceremony, was made possible by someone you were never meant to see. They lived underground. They worked in darkness. They smelled of fire, ash, and waste. And they were as essential to the function of a castle as its walls. The Gong farmer's world, thick with rot and silence, reminds us that history is not built solely by kings or knights or priests, but by hands in muck, by backs bent beneath chamber pots, by boys turning spits for hours with blistered palms. And tonight, as you lie still, safe in a clean room, far from the flickering smoke and sour smells of the medieval world, you can close your eyes knowing something they never could, that someone else will take care of it. The light, the heat, the waste, the mess, all gone, all handled, all invisible. You rest now in a world shaped by their labor, soft, silent, and clean. Sleep well, knowing you've wandered far through forgotten corridors, and come back wiser, without ever leaving your bed. Good night.